you guys are doing stuff that is being seen, understood, and has impact across the nation. Hey, perfect, thank you. I want to talk to you about where I was last week, and it was there, in Salzburg, Austria. That town is called Untersberg. Now, I don't know, you may not recognize it, but my wife did, so that's why she insisted on coming. That's where they shot some of the scenes for Sound of Music. The kids fell into that lake. So she said, I'm coming. I was like, okay. But I want to tell you what I found there. There's something called the Global Salzburg Summit. So after the war, a bunch of semi-crazy 3 Harvard students decided that they were going to create a sort of intellectual Marshall Plan. And so what they started doing was inviting their professors from Harvard and folks from Europe to come together and talk about what's a post-war Europe look like and government, all this other stuff. And then they kept going. And so they've expanded to a global summit. And this year, with IMLS's help, they had a summit on libraries and museums in the era of participatory culture. And they invited people from 24 different countries to come in and talk about what do libraries and museums, what are the skills, how do they determine value. Now, I say this not to just brag, but I am. But I want to say what I saw there was you. What I saw there was your potential. And I'll tell you why I say that. It's not just because it was a pretty place, but the people inside this were amazing people. And they inspired me and really reinvigorated me in such a way that it's the same effect that you folks are having. But I want to tell you just a few of the stories that I heard there. There was the director of a library in the Philippines who, during a typhoon, had her museum under 8 feet of water. The very next day after the waters, she had staff that was trapped in the museum because they were in there to try and get all the kids out of it before the flooding occurred. They all survived. The day after the waters receded, she set up her office in the ladies' toilet because it was the only room that had survived. And as guys know, the ladies' bathroom is in fact a better place. Over the next 6 months, she was able to raise $500,000 to rebuild that library from the ground up, from the community up. They built their own exhibits, they built their own facilities. Like that. We heard from the National Library Service of Kenya. National Library Service of Kenya has a big initiative to build libraries in rural Kenya, which is interesting. Where they can't get enough roads to get the equipment and materials in to build the physical facility, they built donkey carts that carry 5,000 books pulled by 2 donkeys. But in the north of the country, it is remote enough that even the donkeys can't make it there. And so they quite literally strap the library onto the backs of camels and walk them into the cities. They have the materials there, they set up tents, and they set up portable libraries. Now, the point of this is, this camel to those northern tribes is literally the most important asset they own. It gives them transportation, it gives them labor, it gives them milk, it gives them meat when I guess they get older. They even take the dung of the camel, dry it out, and use it as fuel for their stoves. Now, it is also essential because it brings them literacy and reading. It brings them contact to the outside world. When we first met, I went back and looked at my presentation from the first one. I told you about the new Library of Alexandria in Egypt and how I was inspired by them. And there was I told the story about how people grabbed hands in hand and protected the library. You may recall. I love this story. I love this. A good story is gold. And I've used it a couple of times. When I was there, there was the head of IT for the Library of Alexandria was there, and so I went over to her and I said, look, I was sort of writing it up in book form, and I said, could you tell me, is this right? Sort of hoping desperately I hadn't totally screwed it up. And what she said was, well, that's sort of interesting, but you don't quite have it right. She said, what happened was on July, I get the right time, January 23rd, at about 6 p.m. in the afternoon, after government forces had released all the prisoners from the local jail, they departed. There was no security, there was no military, there was no police, there were rapists and looters and murderers amongst the protesters. The protesters, and I asked, so, and you were protesting against Mubarak's rule, this unconstitutional. She goes, no, we were protesting for liberty, equal justice, and equal opportunity. The law, the emergency law, that just became one of the demands after it. What we saw was the youth rise up. And so at that time, when there was lawlessness on the street, the protesters and looters alike were going from government building to government building with Molotov cocktails and burning them down. They left shells of buildings all around Alexandria. And then they turned to the library, and the library wasn't simply a government building. It was a library built specifically by, owned, and thought about by the president they were trying to bring down. If there was a symbol 9 years ago for the president, it was the millions of dollars he put into building this. And as the protesters went forward, as they went out to destroy this building, someone got on the bullhorn and said, no. And that's when they surrounded this building, hand in hand to protect it. This sign says, down with the government. And yet, that building that they're around was a government building. And what I want you to see in this picture is it wasn't just youth as in teens, it was quite literally children, mothers, wives, the elderly. It was the entire population that surrounded that. They would stop the protest at prayer time to pray. But you have to understand the crowds that we're talking about. It's the entire city. And still they stood around that library. In fact, the next day, they asked, we have this flag of liberation, can we drape it on your stairs? And they did. And every day of the protest, the protesters would walk by and they would touch the flag as they began their marching. They retook this library. This wasn't simply a matter of protecting their library. This was claiming their library. In the 9 years since it had opened, the service that they had provided had been so valuable to the people of Alexandria that this was no longer a government building. This was no longer a Mubarak administration. This was theirs. And they were fighting for it as much as they were fighting for anything else. Now, I ask you to take a moment, because I said, I saw you in Salzburg. What do we know about protests? What do we know about uprisings? Occupy Wall Street, Occupy Boston, Occupy Chicago, in Oakland, they're rioting and they have riot police that are shooting. Non-lethal bullets, but they're shooting at protesters. And in the midst of these Occupy everything, you know what they're building? You know what they're putting up on these temporary sites, these temporary facilities? Libraries. The people's libraries. And these are not just carts and crates and books. These are librarians who are doing this. In Occupy Boston, library science students at Simmons are going down after and between classes to run libraries within the protests. I don't care if you agree or disagree with the politics. I don't care, frankly, if you think you want to join them or you want to stop them. But I do want you to recognize that we live in times where truly we have revolutions, where we have big ideas, where we have a world and a country that is in desperate need of that kind of power. What we have been thinking about, what we have been teaching, what we have been working for, what you have learned is not additional to you being a librarian. It's not nice and added. It's not like, you were fine librarians, but now you're librarians plus because you can do this. What we're teaching you is not how to be a librarian for yesterday or even today. what the spirit is, what I think we've been working with, is to be the library of tomorrow. Not to be the librarians for the library of tomorrow, to be the library itself. Because it may be in a building, it may be in a spot, but it may be in plastic crates in a park. It may be with a tablet in a school. It may be all of these things. It may be you alone in a corporation. It may be you in the government. It may be you with a small group of children, teaching them that reading and literacy and learning matters in the summer and not just the classroom. It may be you working with your communities, not simply to find a job, but to transform their lives. It may be you teaching, not simply digitizing, but teaching a state what its cultural heritage is, what its stories, what its origins are, and from there its potential future. It's not that we're developing apps. We are laying the mortar and the foundation of the next wave, the next need, the next generation. We need to expect more of you. You need to expect more of me. And our communities have to expect a whole hell of a lot more from our libraries. And every day that you're back in the community and everything you do, and through your actions, you need to teach them to expect and demand more of us. Because if they don't, if they become accustomed and settled to the mediocrity of our profession and not the potential of our profession, if they see you as the exceptions and not the rule of excellence, then why do we need libraries? Why do we need to do that? Right? We must transform them. We must, through our actions, show our communities that a library is not a building with books, that they cannot be satisfied, and it's our responsibility to make the world a better place. What I saw in Salzburg was you. When you look to the left, when you look to the right, you see what I saw in Salzburg. You see people who may not be presented with typhoons, that may not be pulling camels. But you're seeing people with the same drive, that if you were in those circumstances, you would experience and expect to work the same way. That you may never be presented with a revolution, but you can be revolutionary. That you are now radical change agents. The tools, the technology, that will get, that will learn. The attitude, the assumption, the power that we have, that's what we need to take away from this. So what did I see here? What did I see here this week? What did I see on this stage? Hope. I see the future of this profession, and I see it being pretty bright. And for that, I want to thank you. Thank you all very much. Let's go change the world.